was joined by someone who was sworn into that cabinet from Melbourne, by Josh Frydenberg, Minister for Resources, Energy and Northern Australia. And here in our Sydney studio, Parliamentary Secretary, the Shadow Treasurer, Labor MP Ed Husic. Okay, thanks to both of you for joining us. And Ed Husic, I'll start with you. As the new Turnbull government is bedded in, are we seeing a realignment of Australian politics?
I think there's no denying that the environment has definitely altered. It's changed. Clearly,
you see it as a realignment, literally?
Yeah, I do. I think it has the potential at this stage to open up the prospect of finding some common ground and cooperation, and maybe, just maybe, leaving behind the type of hectoring, shrill attack politics of the past. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And you know, I think the Australian public is after. I don't think anyone's going to be after more division. I want to see if this signals something deeper. Let's wait and see.
Let's go to Josh Frydenberg. Are we seeing a realignment with this new Turnbull government of Australian politics?
Look, I think it's been a very optimistic, positive start by Malcolm Turnbull. His first major announcement was around the National Disability Insurance Scheme. He's just made an announcement about domestic violence and $100 million worth of new initiatives there. He's talking about the future. He's talking about technology. He's talking about renewable energy. And, of course, in his cabinet, he made a very strong statement with 5 women in the cabinet, including Australia's first female Defence Minister. I think is a very positive tone to his language, and he's engaging in that conversation with the Australian people as he promised.
Is the biggest shift philosophically that we're seeing here that basically this is a government led by moderates which is moving to capture the middle ground of Australian politics? Josh?
Well, certainly Malcolm Turnbull is a moderate, and he has made that clear throughout his political and public life. But he's also somebody who's a self-made person, who's had extensive business experience. He's tapped in to the currents of the business community, and I think you'll see that reflected in his economic strategy. And you're already seeing it in the way he's talking about the importance of entrepreneurship and changing the culture of innovation, as well as linking that to education and other areas of public policy.
OK, let's go to Ed Husic. What's left for the Labor Party if Malcolm Turnbull does manage to occupy the middle ground of politics?
I think there's still, I mean, that's a wide open field still, I'd say. While there is, you know, a lot of potential for politics to be conducted in a different way, there are still issues that, you know, will confront the coalition, in particular Malcolm Turnbull. I mean, people I do detect have a sense of just wondering whether or not the Malcolm Turnbull pre-Prime Ministership will be the same Malcolm Turnbull in office, and by that they're expecting some shifts on policy to reflect his pre-Prime Ministerial status. And there are still issues to be dealt with in terms of the economy, in terms of the environment. We still have to see how those will play out.
Josh Frydenberg, another big test for Malcolm Turnbull. Has he seen off the challenge from the right in the Liberal Party?
Look, I think there's a recognition by all my colleagues that our interests as a party, as a government and of course as a nation are best served by rallying behind Malcolm Turnbull as the leader and making sure it's a success, and trying to prevent Bill Shorten from ever occupying the lodge. So I'm very confident that some of those differences have now abated.
Ed Husic, speaking about Bill Shorten, his leadership could be in trouble with the Union's Royal Commission starting up again in a couple of weeks' time in October, focusing once again on the AWU. What happens if Shorten's evidence is undermined by other witnesses at the Royal Commission in the coming weeks?
There are always great predictions about whether or not this will spell the end or trouble or further problems, and we've seen those through. I think the key for us is to be able to keep going the way we are. We've got a Royal Commission we believe is entirely politically motivated, and we can't allow that to distract us from the point that we're releasing new policy, as we have on innovation and higher ed this week.
Let's stick with the Royal Commission for a moment, and because obviously Bill Shorten claims that side deals from employers to pay money to the AWU were not made during EBU negotiations when workers' pay and conditions were being negotiated. He said that's his evidence. What if it's undermined by other witnesses, perhaps with documents, perhaps more than one witness? What happens then?
Well, I'm not jumping at what-if scenarios. I mean, let's see how that plays out. Again, I come back to my point. The issue for us is to not be distracted by politically motivated activities like the Royal Commission and to focus on the delivery of policy. We will cross bridges when we get to them.
Josh Frydenberg, is it at all possible, do you believe, that one of the biggest legacies of Tony Abbott's Prime Ministership might be that the Royal Commission does terrible damage to Bill Shorten's leadership?
Well, look, there have been real questions raised at the Royal Commission about the credibility of Bill Shorten's evidence. We've seen more than 25 union officials, both current and former, referred to law enforcement agencies. We've just had, in recent days, allegations about the shredding of important documents by union officials. This is very significant revelations that are coming out of this Royal Commission, and it's being presided over by one of Australia's preeminent jurists in Dyson Heydon. And despite the Labor Party trying to attack the man with Dyson Heydon, he has survived. He's overseeing a very important Royal Commission, and I'm sure everybody will watch its findings, including Bill Shorten, with great interest.
OK, let's have a look at some other developments this week that sprang out of the first public outings of the new Treasurer, Scott Morrison.
Expenditure as a percentage of GDP is over 26%, which is where it was at the height of the GFC. This is not something that we believe is sustainable. I'm interested in talking to people who have ideas about how we can get spending under control, because we have a spending problem, not a revenue problem.
Scott Morrison's wrong when he says Australia doesn't have a revenue problem. Australia has a revenue issue and a spending issue. Any Treasurer who just rules out dealing with the budget challenges by just saying I'm not going to deal with revenue measures is making a fundamental mistake.
But there are so many pressures driving these costs up, Lee, and we need to keep the pressure on them down. And the one way to let it get out of hand is go, it's OK, we can just raise taxes and then we can spend and spend and spend.
We have to do with both, that spending is higher than at the average of the Howard years and revenue is lower. The difference between those two is the difference between surplus and deficit.
But my point about revenue measures and spending measures is there is a tendency to think, well, we can deal with the budget issue just by jacking up taxes on everyone.
Josh Frydenberg, so we've got a Treasurer who says we've got a spending problem, not a revenue problem. Why is he ruling out the idea that we have a revenue problem when most economists agree that we're heading over a fiscal cliff in terms of revenue?
Well, this gap between revenue and expenditure is significant, and you can't just lift revenue without a major impact on, for example, productivity or workforce participation. So Scott Morrison's absolutely correct to point to the expenditure commitments that we inherited from the previous government. Now, we were very successful in reducing the rate of spending growth from 3.5% that we inherited annualised to just to 1.5%. But there's still a long way to go, and the government is committed at a bipartisan level to important government schemes like the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and in order to fund those schemes, as well as increasing medical funding and expenditure, as well as education funding, we have to find savings, and that is what any prudent Conservative coalition government will do.
I've got to ask you this, if you have to find savings, the way to do that's going to be obviously to have another budget like the first hockey budget that makes big savings, that cuts into programs. Is that what you expect to happen?
No, I differ with that. In fact, the second Abbott budget saw Scott Morrison play a lead role in finding $2.4 billion worth of savings for changes around the pension. That was a significant saving that we achieved against the wishes of the Labor government with the support of the Greens, and it helped improve the budget bottom line by $2.4 billion. So I don't believe that you do need to slash spending dramatically. You can make prudent savings, and Scott Morrison has shown his ability to do just that.
All right, very briefly on this, you would have seen the former Treasury Secretary Ken Henry on 7:30 explaining the extent of the revenue black hole that Australia faces. It's running at a 2.5% of GDP now, but Ken Henry says with the ageing population, that's going to increase by another 5% on top of that. That's a massive fiscal deficit that's coming. Can you really say in the face of that we don't have a revenue problem?
I think we can say that we are thinking constructively about tax reform, and when we are thinking about tax reform, we're working on how to boost productivity, how to boost workforce participation, how to invite further investment in this country. They're issues that now Scott Morrison, Kelly O'Dwyer, Malcolm Turnbull will be focusing hard on, and I think we can play with the tax system in a positive way which can actually boost the economy.
Ed Husick, play with the tax system in a positive way without necessarily needing to raise more revenue. Is it possible to do both things?
I think that degree of verbal gymnastics earns Josh a a 10.0, my friend. I think that was a very impressive move. I think I wouldn't mind actually taking back a step to look at, in terms of where the economy's at. The economy is below trend. It is not growing as strongly as it should be. It's not growing enough to deal with unemployment. And if the prescription that is being advanced by the coalition is to cut spending further in a way that has a contractionary impact on the economy,
can you really imagine another tough cutting budget like the first hockey budget, though? I mean, before an election.
Well, in a scenario where we have a new face and the same old message, the new face of Scott Morrison with the same old message about a spending problem, yes, I can, because he seems to be adamant that he needs to be able to cut spending. You saw in some of those excerpts already from the discussions he's had this week that he's fixed on this. And we need to be very mindful that we don't make decisions that impact on the growth of the economy because it's already under trend, and it doesn't have an impact on confidence. And when Josh is talking about bringing investment into the country, not making decisions like in the last budget, nearly $750 million in new fees and charges on foreign investment at a time where we do need more inflows to support economic activity.
Josh Frydenberg, can I ask you, the debate on tax reform seemed to get shoved back into Pandora's box last week to some degree, and particularly the debate about the GST. Is this really about keeping the GST locked away before an election? So there's no more talk about the GST, because both Abbott and Hockey seem to be warming to the idea of a GST rise.
Well, as you know, Mike Baird had been the chief protagonist in the GST debate, and he's, Australia's most successful premier, and he's one that governs over an economy which is 1/3 of the size of the nation's economy. And so, we were very happy to see him put forward the arguments for this debate. But the GST involves complex discussions with the states, and I'm sure Scott Morrison and the Prime Minister will be focusing on this in the period ahead.
So you think the GST argument will come back on the table during the tax reform debate, do you? Because it seemed to me that it's been shelved so that it doesn't end up as a hurdle you have to jump over before the next election.
Look, I'll leave that to the Treasurer and the Prime Minister to opine on.
But it sounds like you think it should be on the table, the GST discussion. You obviously respect what Mr Baird said about it.
Well, the coalition under John Howard and Peter Costello were very successful in introducing a GST, which is now accepted wisdom in Australia. Dare I say it, against the wishes of the Labor Party, and Australia's GST is low by international comparisons. But this is a debate that Scott Morrison and the Prime Minister are now driving, and those decisions and those announcements and those reflections will be left to them.
There's a whole grab bag of coded messages in there.
What were they?
He just can't come out and say that he wants to support the GST increase. We almost had the actual confession that the plan has been unlocked from the attic in the lodge, and he's definitely going to get a run on the front lawn. So I think if that's all that tax reform's about with the coalition, in terms of hitting particular low and middle income earners, and not dealing with, for example, in a much more stronger, strident way, multinational, making sure that our tax system is fit for purpose, dealing with multinationals and the way that they treat our taxation system, that's a problem. And I think it's hard to get the public on board when that's the case. There are other areas too where, if I can very briefly say, like as we've said, on the issue of the call on government through tax concessions offered to wealthy superannuants. These things need to be looked at as well. You can't hit pensioners but then leave wealthy superannuants to be having a major drain on revenue in the way that this is occurring in this country.
OK, let's have a look at another philosophical change that happened this week. A new passion for renewable energy and the revival of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, ARENA.
Obviously, under Malcolm Turnbull, there's a deep, long history of support for renewable energy.
That wasn't there with Tony Abbott and Joe.
No, look, I'm not saying that. He has had a unique personal history in this space. It's a shared passion in terms of both climate change and renewable energy.
Can we put it this way? The war on renewables is now over.
Well, from my perspective, there never was a war on renewables.
And I must say, I find those wind turbines around Lake George to be utterly offensive.
Correct.
And
correct.
I think they're just a blight on the landscape.
And the people you're talking to are paying for them.
Yeah.
Up close, they're ugly, they're noisy, and they may have all sorts of other impacts, which I will leave to the scientists to study.
I find them, and have always found them, an appropriate part of Australia's energy.
Josh Frydenberg, this is a major philosophical shift, is it not? And let me ask you this, do you share your new leader's passion for renewable energy?
I absolutely do, and renewable energy is an important part of the domestic energy mix. And we showed our true colours there, Tony, when we reached a bipartisan agreement with the Labor Party for 23.5% of our energy coming from renewable sources by 2020. That's an important target, but I don't see that as being mutually exclusive with continuing to have a successful mining sector as well as an energy sector, both for export as well as for domestic use. And therefore, I'll continue to push renewable energies, but also as the Minister for Energy and Resources, I'll continue to push fossil fuels as well.
Well, to say the least, Tony Abbott was lukewarm on renewable energy, he was lukewarm on the science of climate change, he was positively hostile to public transport. These are big philosophical shifts, aren't they?
There is a bit of shift, of course, both in the the public statements of our new Prime Minister compared to our previous one. But I think that will be welcomed by the Australian community. People have to understand, to make a wind turbine, you need 220 tonnes of coking coal. To make a solar panel, you need 16 different minerals and metals. I mean, you cannot have renewable energy without using coal or other minerals and metals.
Ed Husick, fantastic job by Coalopedia. You know, you had one job to do, Josh, and that was to tell us that we'd be having the National Hugger Wind Farm Day, and you couldn't even bring yourself to do it. But it is remarkable that we've had, I almost feel like we need to give the nation a collective neck brace for the big shift that we're having to perform, having had a situation where the coalition under Tony Abbott was demonising the role of wind farms and the important role that they have to play in terms of changing the energy mix in this country, to now having a potential for them to actually now warm their view or thaw their view on renewables. If this happens, this will be a good thing, but the fact of the matter is we can't dither on this. We do need to find a way to alter the energy mix to be able to generate renewable energy in a much more efficient way, but also to do it in a way that has obviously, through the generation of energy, less of an impact on the environment.
Can I just say this very briefly, because we are out of time pretty much, but this is ground that's been staked out in the past by the Greens and by the Labor Party, and now it's been occupied once again by Malcolm Turnbull and this new government. This is going to be bad news for you, isn't it, in electoral terms? I
think the nation has been yearning for where it's possible for parties to find common ground, particularly on the things that matter in advancing the country. That doesn't mean that you give up necessarily, that Josh will give up on things he believes in, or I give up on the things I believe in. I think there is a role for competitive ideas, but it should be done and conducted in a way that we are not utterly focused on tearing the other side down. That's, I think, an important difference.
I'm afraid we're out of time. Ed Husick, Josh Frydenberg, we thank both of you for joining us on this first week of a brand new government. Well, at least a brand new Prime Minister.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks, Ed.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks, Tony.